I have this older MSI laptop, and it's not been turning on recently. I wanted to kind of investigate why and see if I could fix it. I've already checked the battery. That seems pretty good. And I've started to take it apart, and nothing like immediately jumps out as being wrong to me. Although I do kind of suspect that maybe the button cell is bad. So let's try that. And yeah, there we go, it's totally dead. Now this is a CR2032, and nominally these are 3 volts. I don't have a replacement, but I do have a couple of AAAs, and these are 1.5 volts each. So in series they should be 3 volts. Let's just make it nice and secure. Put the heat pipe back in. And pop the battery in, and that should be good to go. But that's not what we're doing today. See, my wife Melinda needs a computer for her craft room, but it's got to fit her aesthetic. And her aesthetic is kind of retro and eclectic. How would you say?
Like happy colors.
Bright and happy colors. And I don't know if you've seen desktop PCs lately, but they're usually not that. Now I know what you're thinking. Another white guy with a tech channel. But joke's on you, because I'm a quarter Japanese, so racist. I'm EJ, and today EJ stands for Adulterating a Jardinier. We're going to build her a computer, but we're going to floral it up. The first order of business was to pick a base coat color. Melinda wanted kind of a violet or eggplant or plum, so we went to the store and picked out a nice deep purple. For the case, I already happen to have a couple micro ATX rose will cases. One's being used with a FreeNAS server in my basement, but I have this extra one in the garage that would work well, and it's been there for months, and as you can see, it could use some cleaning. The spider webs and eggs were especially spooky. And really, aside from being covered in junk, it's still in perfectly good condition. And inside we have a Foxconn motherboard and some more gross. Anyway, this is an older Foxconn motherboard, manufactured, I think, shortly after the Civil War. I had originally used it for CG rendering a few years ago, but it'll still be adequate for Melinda's uses. This is a micro ATX board, so it's just held in with these 6 motherboard screws. In order to remove it, I'll just take out these 6 screws and disconnect the front I/O cables. Quick look around the board. First, we have a floppy connector that'll be incredibly useful for when I need to archive half of an MP3. We have an IDE connector, which is about as useful. 24-pin power connector, so it's at least new enough to not have the 20-pin header, 2 PCI slots, and, perhaps dial-up internet like fascism and measles will make a comeback, so maybe we'll install a V92 modem at some point. A 4-pin header for supplemental CPU power. I think this board has an AM3 socket. This is using an old enough chipset that the South Bridge hasn't yet been integrated into the CPU, it's still its own chip on the board. 4 SATA connections, I think it's SATA revision 2, which is unfortunate. However, I'll be using an older hard drive, and it won't come close to saturating that bus anyway. We have a cool parallel port connector for, a dot matrix printer. Next to that, a DB9 port for a Cold War era mouse or a terminal or teletype. A couple PS2 ports for slightly less ancient keyboard and mouse connections, 4 USB 2.0 ports, and kind of surprisingly, an integrated gigabit NIC. Let's give it a quick once-over for safety. Gonna remove the fans. This rear one is an 80mm, and the one at front is a 120. They're both stock, they came with the case, but they're not teabag. 5 of these standoffs were loose enough that I could use my fingers, but I needed a 3/16 socket for this last one. It was in there pretty tight. And might as well remove the other side panel at this point. And that front bezel has to come off to unscrew the front fan. Here's a neat trick. Keep a little baggie nearby to keep your doodads in, and you won't lose them. I'm going to carefully pop out the I/O shield since we're going to reuse it later. And then suddenly, I saw this. To paint the bezel, we're going to remove the front USB and audio ports. This PCB is just held in with some screws. I'll also remove the reset switch and LED. The power switch was a little trickier. The actuator itself was just held in with this little screw, but the power LED was hot glued in. And I wasn't sure if I was going to replace the LED later on, so with some tweezers, I carefully performed some surgery. To prep for painting, I'm going to use this orbit sander with some coarse sandpaper. I'm not trying to get to the bare metal, I was just worried that the primer wouldn't bond well, and in retrospect, sanding might not have been necessary. I went over it with a little bit finer grit by hand. After getting all that paint dust off, we're finally ready to prime. I'm using some steel wire to hang the pieces from the rafters in my garage. The garage doors also open a little bit for some ventilation. And I've spray painted stuff in the past this way, and it always seems to come out more even than painting it while it's sitting on something, so I try to do this when possible. I'm doing very light, dusty coats of primer. I like to do more coats and use less primer per coat, rather than the other way around. It takes longer and takes some patience, but I think the results are worth it. With some fine sandpaper, I'm gonna lightly sand the dried primer just to remove any high spots. Now for the paint. Like with the primer, I try to do very light coats. I also tend to change the direction that I'm painting between coats to avoid getting a stripy or grain-like pattern. Melinda came home here and hit the garage door opener, and the door came down on my tripod and gave me this cool unintended camera move. And so, as punishment, I made her help me spray paint the inside of the case. It probably would have been a good idea to use 2 wires to support this piece, since it had a tendency to spin. Once those pieces had dried, I moved to the front bezel. This time I skipped the primer. I'm not really sure why. I think I thought that the plastic was smooth enough that the paint would bond fine without it. Honestly, I don't know. And then using a light, I'm just checking for areas I missed. Going from black to purple, it's kind of hard to tell if the coverage is even. Temporarily, I'm going to install the hardware, or at least most of it, so Melinda can use the computer until she settles on a design for the outside. I'm going to start by installing these 6 motherboard standoffs, and then the fans. The keen-eyed among you might notice that I'm installing the I/O shield upside down. That's an artistic choice and is in no way a mistake that I have to immediately fix. Speaking of non-accidents, this motherboard standoff was in the wrong hole. Now we can install the motherboard. I've already installed the CPU and memory. I'm using one of my favorite processors, and more importantly, one that's compatible with an AM3 socket. This is an AMD Phenom 2 X4. The DIMMs are each 4 gigs of DDR3, so a total of 8 gigabytes. The CPU cooler is an Alpine 64 from Arctic, but honestly I'd never heard of it. It just had good reviews and was cheap, so it's what we went with. And 6 screws to mount it to the case. For the power supply, I'm using an Antec Earthwatts because it's what I already had from when this was one of my rendering machines. It's 380 watts and it'll be fine for now. For the finished project though, we'll be adding a graphics card and I'll probably need to upgrade this. This power supply, by the way, is most definitely not modular, but it also doesn't have too many extra cables either, so it's a very usable choice even in a mini tower. We'll plug in the CPU power and 24-pin power cables. I'm going to install a 320GB Western Digital Blue hard drive, another leftover from when this was a render node. It's a little old, but it'll get the job done. I'm also routing some of the power cables behind the motherboard tray. Cable management in this case isn't really necessary because this case doesn't have a window, but some zip ties will at least keep them from rattling around. After a while of Melinda using her computer, we decided that it was time to finish it up. First we got this graphics card. This is an EVGA GTX 470, hot off the presses from eBay. She's not really interested in 4K or 120Hz, so for our purposes this is totally fine. Two DVI ports, an HDMI port, blower style fan, 2 6-pin power connectors. She may not look like much, but she also doesn't really got it where it counts. However, I was worried about that 380 watt power supply being able to keep up, so as a precaution we also grabbed this slightly beefier power supply. This is an 80 plus bronze 450 watt fella from EVGA. Again, not modular, but it is a fabulous value. Time to make the case look good. You might be able to see that Melinda started to paint it and that she's finished the top. We also decided to replace the power switch with this ringlet one. I love how these look. We opted on one with an amber or yellow light. I can use a 9-volt battery to test it and see how it looks, and ooh, I think that's going to look good. This is a momentary single pole, single throw switch, I guess, though it has 2 terminals that are normally open and 2 that are normally closed. We'll be using normally open terminals, so pressing the switch closes the circuit momentarily. I'm using a Dremel to cut off the back of where the original switch sat. The one that we have now should fit really well into this hole. Try doing a dry fit, and like a flippin' glove. I'm wiring up the LED leads. I'm using red for positive and brown for negative because I didn't have any black jumper wire. I feel like everyone says this, but disclaimer, I'm not great at soldering. I'm also not great at heat shrinking. Please don't be upset. I used some green and blue wire for the switch leads because polarity doesn't matter here, and that's just what I happen to have on hand. Testing my soldering, and the LED still works, so that's good. Pressing the switch also gives continuity, so it's wired right. Alright. The switch is a bit too long to fit as is, so using the bezel as a template, I'm making a mark on the metal that I'll have to cut away. And I'm using a cheapo 12-volt drill and some crap bits that are really not great for metal, even aluminum. These are not the right tools for the job. Better yet, the largest twist bit I had is 1/2 inch, which still wasn't big enough. And desperation can provoke terrible ideas, so checking to see that nobody from OSHA was around, I grabbed a paddle bit. It didn't work. Well, that bit of defeat knocked me out of my stupor, and I grabbed my Dremel with a cutoff wheel. See, the hole doesn't need to be circular. It doesn't even need to be pretty. It just needs to be wide enough to fit the blue end of the switch. Praise Jesus. Melinda has painted the side panels, and it's time to give them a clear taco. I think we went with semi-gloss. In order for the hard drive indicator LED to shine through this tiny little window here, I'm using some alcohol and tweezers to scrape away the paint. We also decided against using the original red LED because it didn't fit the aesthetic, so I'm replacing it with a green one. This is a 3-volt LED, so I can test it with 2 AA batteries. Since the original one was hot glued in, I'm gonna hot glue this one too. It works fine though, so I'm not complaining. Using the retaining nut that came with the switch, we can secure it in place. The front I/O board can also be reinstalled now. Even though I had spliced the switch leads once before to give them some extra length, they still ended up being a bit short, so I'm going to splice them again. Alaska, remind me to buy longer jumper wire. Like my bad Western Union splices, I'm very fragile, so please don't yell at me. But finally, we can put it all together. Step 1. Install the bezel. Step 2. Screw in the motherboard standoffs. Step 3. Mount the rear fan. Step 4. Remove the bezel because you forgot to mount the front fan. Step 5. Mount the front fan. Step 6. Install the I/O shield. Step 7. Mount the motherboard. Step 8. Forget to film the installation of the hard drive. Step 9. Break off the PCIe slot covers for the graphics card and install the graphics card. Step 10. Plug in both 6-pin PCIe connectors. Step 11. Plug in a monitor and turn the computer on. Step 12. Jump cut past when you forgot to plug in the monitor and hope nobody notices. Step 13. Wah, blah, 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 blah. How about that? Well, this project seems turned out pretty good. I'm really happy with how the computer turned out. Melinda did a great job painting it, and it seems to be working out well for her, doesn't it, Minna? Hmm? Be sure to rate this video 5 stars and email it to all your friends. I've been EJ, and you've been watching the internet. Ja mata ne. Bye-bye.